All right, can everybody hear me? Usually I'm a loud talker, so that's not going to be a problem. I recognize this is the very last session of the day, and I know that that's always a bummer, so maybe we should take some deep breaths first, and I will definitely try to entertain you. It's wonderful to see former colleagues and bosses in the audience, so with that, it's wonderful to be here. I'm here to talk about towards nature-positive mining. So the mining industry certainly has, as an extractive industry, a number of reputational risks and or associations with the way the earth is used. And there are a bunch of different ways that we are bringing environmental services and or environmental products to market, and we think the restoration ecology and economy could be really important. I work at a company called South Pole, which is a carbon climate mitigation company. We're probably a little strange to you. I'll give a brief intro in a second. But really, the key here is we're not going to live in a world with cell phones in our pockets without mining or drive here. One of the ways that we could try to mitigate these emissions is through nature-based solutions, which is using the power of ecology to bring about a restorative climate and a restorative economic system. It's really from the point of view of the mining companies. Sorry, I'm walking in the way, aren't I? It's about risk management, right? You guys are seeing lots of climate exposures in your operations. You're seeing the need to strengthen relationship with key stakeholders, whether they're end buyers of your products or stakeholder communities around your mining sites. We're also thinking that it's really important to try to bring about long-term financial success, not selling only mineral components, but part of the circular economy, right? I just was speaking with some folks from Vale who are using tailings as a marketable product. And we're thinking that carbon benefits and biodiversity credits or claims are going to be a part of that as new revenue streams. Really briefly, because this presentation is going to be with them, you can have access to it later. We've been around as a company for roughly 18 years. We've done a lot of carbon credit project development. We've abated roughly 200 million tons through a variety of project activities, including fuel switching, like to hydrogen, which I just learned a lot about. And we have roughly 820 people spread throughout the world. The vision is over 1,000 companies decarbonizing, about 200 million. As I said, that's sort of 5 times the annual emissions of Switzerland. And we've been involved since 2006 in developing carbon credit projects for the voluntary and compliance markets. Here's a number of companies we work with. And now getting to sort of the conundrum that you guys face, right? How do we keep mining and how do we supply the world with necessary commodities and not continue to represent 4 to 7% of global greenhouse gas emissions? Most of that, by the way, is coal and coal bed methane leaching. So if you're not involved in that piece of the mining world, that's a little bit better. But it is important to think about how your footprint and your image and your product are moving around the world, and whether or not an altered climate in the future impacts your ability to continue to do business. And our supposition is that a climate-altered future increases a bunch of physical risks and a bunch of climate risks for your operations. But the scope, we've been hearing about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. There's a fair number of those associated with steel and aluminum. Most of the mining companies, many of the ones here, have net zero targets and are on their way, and most of them don't really include scope 3. This is too many words for late in the day. I get that. The climate risks that we're talking about for the mine sites, and you guys can allude to more than what we've got, but a bunch of them are physical challenges, right? Water and energy are going to be more constrained in the future. You've got increased precipitation. You've got sort of extreme weather events, droughts, et cetera. And those are going to include wildfire risks. So we're starting to see a lot of climate-altered dynamics, like the big fires in California that are happening in the US right now in what should be a nice wet winter season. Doesn't look like fire season is seasonal anymore. It looks like we're going to start to see those things globally in a more regular affair. And those are going to impact operations. I think it's also important to consider that likely there's going to be issues associated with employee health, especially as temperatures rise. And the shifts in commodity demand is going to be interesting as we move into this energy transition and or whatever the next cell phone dynamic chemicals are going to be, because most mining companies are really dependent upon a couple of different commodities. So being flexible in that way to generate multiple revenue streams is going to be interesting. Perhaps the most important piece of the puzzle is really obtaining the social license to operate, right? And that's your big ESG dynamic. All right, that's a whole lot of stuff. I think I'm going to stay with the most important piece at the bottom, which is really a focus for carbon, water, soils, ecosystems, and social and economic benefits and livelihoods for all kinds of landscapes that surround your mine site. So the restoration work that's required for whatever your concession agreement looks like is important, but we believe that there's a much bigger opportunity at a landscape scale for restoration in buffer zones around your concession areas, for example, or your land areas, where you can drive ecosystem benefits with associated stakeholders and on your lands as well. The carbon credit projects with certified markets are going to be fetching much higher prices, especially in these new compliance markets. And it isn't going to compete with your minerals, mind you, or your metals, but it is going to cover potentially operating costs, right? And I think a couple examples from the mining world, right? The catalytic role from having these large landscapes and these large land holdings gives you the power to have a number of different nature-based interventions. Those are not only tree planting, which is normally what everybody considers, right? Nature-based solutions, let's plant trees, that's great. But there's also a bunch of work protecting wetlands, riparian areas, biodiversity impacts, and biodiversity markets are now selling biodiversity credits and or claims, depending upon the market you move into. And those are likely to generate revenue. I think I'll give you an example from Rio Tinto, which has a project that is roughly 500,000 hectares that they've put in a mix of activities. There's restoration of degraded landscapes and degraded and previously mined areas. There's a fair amount of land management activities, which incorporates planning for watershed management, hydropower, water retention and reduction in floodwaters, erosion control, and a bunch of livelihoods impacts for people that are indirect stakeholders in this mine area. And in that 500,000 hectares, they're generating roughly 1 million tons of carbon credits a year. Those credits are going to be Corsia compliant, which currently is selling at about $35. So that's a $35 million return on a relatively large investment, but the project life cycle for that is 40 years. Another one, Anglo American is exploring using nature-based solutions for biodiversity, specifically in Brazil. And those carbon neutral goals are specifically focusing on ways that they can enhance biodiversity benefits through using their mined lands as biodiversity corridors or bridges or links between various ecosystems that become separated as a result of the actual mining activity. And then in North America, there is a company, Teck. You guys are familiar with all three of these, I expect. And one of the interesting things that Teck is doing is really capturing indigenous knowledge, right? Local communities and local knowledge for wildfire management specifically. And wildfires in North America are increasingly more common and more virulent. But the nurseries and revegetation areas are really focused on now using native species instead of what was usually used in the past are plantations of exotics that were fast-growing monocultures. And those are now heavily discouraged because the local biodiversity isn't adapted to it. And they also end up not surviving very well. So it's an interesting market, these carbon credits. I think it's of use to think in this there's a chart here of sort of cost rising and then CO2 potential, or the removal, and you see at the bottom, the cheaper things are these nature-based solutions, and that kind of makes sense, right? We've evolved with ecosystems on planet Earth for 4 billion years. It's like the appropriate technology solution. And we are working more or less in this biochar dynamic, which is really important for re-fertilizing soils so that you can engage in afforestation and reforestation and restoration more effectively. But these direct air capture and enhanced weathering are significantly more expensive, but are still possibilities for mining companies, especially because you guys happen to have lots and lots of access to things like lime, right? There is one thing that's interesting to recognize in the carbon market world. There's a distinct preference for what they call removals as opposed to avoidance. So we're not trying to conserve and protect and alleviate the future cutting of a forest. Instead, what they're really focusing on is sequestration out of the atmosphere now. That was driven to a great extent by the direct air capture and sort of the high-tech people. But we're seeing that you can generate these removals after a couple of years at scale. There's a whole process to bringing a carbon project like any other project to market, and we'd be happy to walk you through that at any point. I think a couple of trends for you guys. These are sort of more on the macroeconomic side and probably of interest. So in terms of getting to net zero, you can see this is a baseline emission scenario of the planet, and essentially this orange section shows you where we're heading. And if we don't reduce from, start funding climate action and have some sort of positive benefit in the short term, we're not going to get there, right? We're not going to be able to keep a 2-degree world. So there's sort of a physical demand that's working and driving the net zero focus, because we need to be down here, and instead we're up in the orange, right? This is global emissions. And again, you're not the culprit, right? You have your 4 to 7% of the emissions, as does transportation, as does housing, as does... So the idea is just how do we participate in creating a net zero market, and in this case, use growing markets and revenue generation of new products on your already existing assets. And these are 2 different projections sort of what the market looks like in 2023 for carbon credit sales. This is a commodity market that doesn't look like minerals, but it's burgeoning and growing. And this is an assessment from MSCI or Trove. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're sort of market research entities in carbon credits. Their projections are that we're going to be in the 8.4 gigaton scenario in an optimistic future for carbon. So we're going from 0.16 gigatons last year, or 2023, to a massive scale up in demand. This is going to be driven by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change's Article 6, which is country-to-country trading, which is now required. And it's also going to be driven by airlines and the CORSIA compliance market. The difference is over here, it's more voluntary, and over here it's more compliance. So regulatory compliance markets are going to drive investments. And I think it's important. This is a similar assessment done by Bloomberg. And then lastly, it's just an environment of significant demand outstripping supply. So this is an opportunity to create a product that's going to be higher priced, right? 2 quick points on the next 2 slides. You'll see here, this is sort of the growth in capital committed to NBS, to all carbon projects, but you'll notice that NBS, which is this jurisdictional red, nature restoration, and red plus, so pretty much these green factors here are the amount of money that's been committed to generate these offsets. And the market is going to be exploding. And then lastly, it's who's giving that money, right? And you'll notice that it used to start out, it was asset owners like yourselves, mining companies, and corporates, and we're starting to see huge investments from investment funds, right? That's the biggest sort of new actor in the climate change space, are investment banks coming in to finance and capitalize these, thinking about the change in price of the credits as they come for compliance markets. So it's fascinating to watch as investment banks arrive with the money and the flash, and they say, okay, we're ready to invest. You do what we say, but the view on the ground doesn't work that way. So there's a disjunct between the expectations of the banks and the money people and the people on the ground who can actually do the work, they don't fit in scale terms. The asset owners are looking for $5 million to plant forests on 4,000 hectares, and the banks want to invest a minimum of 25 million. And so we're having to bundle and create activities at scale, which means we're engaging with governments more. All right, let's see. I think you don't need that. I'm going to show you an example of one in Colombia, and then I'm going to sort of break for questions, I think. This is a case in Colombia where mining activities, this is a project that we ran through the cycle and we've been selling carbon credits from in the market for years. And so they're finding ways to capture a separate revenue stream from an area that was sort of wildcatted, right? So in Colombia, this particular landscape, it's roughly 1,300 hectares, something like that. So not huge, right? But nevertheless, this is what it looked like. There were just massive amounts of illegal artisanal miners that showed up and started stripping landscapes and river systems, pulling out gold mostly. And so this project is called Azorpar. It is certified under the Voluntary Carbon Standards, or VERA, if you're familiar with those. And the VERA requirements, it's now in its third verification. We've been doing those about every 4 or 5 years, where auditors come and determine what happened on the ground and if indeed our projections and growth rates are holding up. And we're expecting that there's roughly 130,000 credits that are going to be issued in this third tranche. And those finances in this case, because it was illegal mining, it wasn't like a mining company, there is no end user who's accountable for paying for the restoration work. And we're using carbon finance in this case to generate, this is what the area looks like 10 years later. Essentially restored to some extent. It's not a completely native primal forest, but it's on its way. And we use a bunch of native trees as foster ecosystems to create a biodiversity benefit, hydrologic benefit, erosion control, and the native trees bring in more bird activity, more birds disperse more seeds, and then you end up having sort of a catalytic effect in that way. Let's see. All right, so there are a couple of other slides in the back of this, which are sort of examples of mining projects or NBS projects that mining companies have undertaken. But I don't know that this is rocket science to any of you, right? It's just accessing the market with expertise to bring a new product to market, which is something that we've been working with a few mining companies on currently, and we'd love to expand the reach, and we'd also love it for mining companies to see that working on an increased impact on ESG dynamics is an investment in their future, as opposed to thinking of it only as a cost and a burden. I guess with that, yeah, these are sort of simple cases. And again, I think will the presentation be available to them later? Okay, maybe, we're not sure. Maybe. So in Peru, upland mine sites where people are generating, again, it's a forest conservation and restoration. Here again in Colombia, these, of course, NBS works outside of Latin America. It's just the examples I happen to pick. And then, there you go. There's another case, which is a sustainable timber plantation. I know in Madagascar, we're working right now on a project activity, which is also sustainable timber on a very large mine site that is for, I want to say, molybdenum, or maybe inputs for stainless steel. But, all right. So with that, why don't you guys, I guess I'll answer questions if you have them, and I'll leave you here. Yeah. Any questions about accessing carbon markets or biodiversity markets? Yeah. Oh, he's bringing it.
Thanks so much. My name is Gavin Tate, the CSO for Renovata Solution Group, a fellow ecologist. Very happy to see your presentation. Biodiversity credits is evolving quite quickly.
Yes.
I hope they don't repeat the same mistakes as carbon credits. And that's one driver for nature-based solutions in mining. But do you have any examples that you could share where they are used in operations, for example, constructed wetlands, for tailings management, or bioremediation, etc., that you have already implemented for some of your clients?
Okay, so there's really two questions in there. Thank you for both of them. The first one is a quick sort of historical look at the landscape of biodiversity markets. And then a second are examples where ecosystems, specifically potentially constructed ecosystems like wetlands, are used with companies that we've worked with. So the first one is the biodiversity markets concept is now, well, carbon markets, which have had some challenges, especially with respect to nature-based solutions, with respect to the quality of those projects and the quality of the certification standards. If you think about a commodity market, a new one, the carbon market is roughly 21 or 2 years old. And it's now in the end of 2023, which is the last date we have metrics for, it was just over $1 trillion traded. This is the voluntary system, not the compliance system. EU ETS accounts for already, I think, 30 billion, roughly 30 billion in trade. So it's beginning to be a legitimate activity. The biodiversity markets question comes from the fact that carbon uses a metric ton of CO2 equivalent that's created anywhere in the world as a fungible unit. And biodiversity markets are really much more ecosystem dependent, right? So the kind of benefit I have in a tundra system is different than in a desert system, is different than in a tropical wet forest system. And there have been great challenges trying to figure out, for the demand side, the people that are buying biodiversity benefits and credits, how do they relate to each other and what kind of action is needed to create a value. There are currently, and we just had a very big conference of the parties in Colombia that was the biodiversity convention, and it looks like there's a trend towards national level compliance markets where they define what is the tradable item, right? And often that's in area of land that has been improved specifically with monitoring and reporting for biodiversity benefits. So you demonstrate you had positive impact on on 100 hectares, and then you issue, according to the rules of the Colombian biodiversity market, a credit for trade. And then if I'm a company that is cutting down forests, I need to offset with credible credits in that market. There are somewhere on the order, you might even know this better than me, but there's something like a dozen compliance markets at national scales. The rest of the world is trying to make, and most of the corporates that are really pushing the agenda on biodiversity implementation are working on claims. So they credibly claim the benefits they have from their project activities, but they're not issuing credits, and yet those claims are generating revenue for a bunch of different ways in which they're reducing erosion, they're increasing forest cover, they're changing temperatures, they're, in many cases, the most important are flood control. Now, South Pole, as I mentioned, we worked with 1,000 plus clients all over the world over the last 18 years, and in the NBS space, we've built a number of constructed wetlands, specifically for nitrate processing through trees and plants. There are a number of other systems that are biochar, so we build a bunch of biomass growing on toxic chemicals. Then those get pyrolyzed or burned into biochar, and then they're land applied in an inert form that is fertilizer. So you can take a degraded mine site, right, where there's been some sort of surface removal, and you'll add biomass from, typically from the same landowner, right, the same holding of the mining company, where there's an improved forest management component not on the mine section, that's some future dynamic to be harvested. That's pyrolyzed, spread across an impacted area, which dramatically improves water retention, soil fertility, and the capacity to grow the forest of the future on that degraded site. So we've done some constructed wetlands work, and that's in North America, Europe, and Latin America, and we've done a fair amount of sort of the aggregated biochar approach to restoration with usually native species and a landscape ecology approach that is focused on not only carbon, but focused on biodiversity, usually claims, which means we have fixed reporting, monitoring, reporting, and verification processes that third-party auditors come and check, and those claims are then used as part of the ESG story. Now, if it's a biodiversity credit, those are expensive, and they're worth a lot of money. We're finding that the compliance markets in those 12 systems, that the credits are worth, on average, something like 5 to 10 times what a carbon credit is worth. So, any other questions about ecosystem service markets? Or is it just too late in the day? Everybody's torched. Yeah, you have one? No, he's torched. Yeah. No? Anybody here engaged with your company in an ecosystem service project or a carbon credit project? Yeah? The ecologist here. Anybody else? Is this totally outside the realm of your conception of what the mining company should be doing? Yeah? Outside? Anybody ever bought a carbon credit? For all the flying? Offset your plane travel? No. All right. So this is novel. You guys, this is new to you. It's only like 20 years old on planet Earth, so it's not that surprising. But interestingly, this might be your first taste of something that you're going to see coming more frequently in the future. I guess with that, is there a question over here? All right, I think we do have one.
Okay, thank you for the floor. My question is, when you are on the process of mining, you kill a lot of animals, like species of animals. But when it comes to restoration, how do you find? Do you really think of the number of animals that maybe were killed or maybe moved from the space? Then do you try to recover those animals like snakes or different types of?
Okay, that's a great question. So it's an integrated question of what you measure is what you manage for, right? And if you don't measure it, it's typically not necessarily a priority. When we're working with a client to try to work through a biodiversity claim or a carbon restoration activity in general, we want to be monitoring a number of different flora and fauna characteristics that we're then going to create. In theory, we create the structure within that ecosystem for those different animals to move and migrate and repopulate. So we're going to be measuring insects. We're going to be measuring a bunch of different arthropods in the soil. We're going to be measuring amphibians, as well as like your snakes, right? A bunch of reptiles, and then birds and mammals to a great extent. And so we'll take surveys of those ecosystems, and if they're already degraded, we'll go to something that is comparable nearby, usually in an adjacent forest area or an adjacent landscape that's the same ecosystem. We set a baseline of what kind of movement of those animals are happening now, and also plots of what tree species are there in what frequency, right? And then when you go to restore, your target is to try to get back to the baseline. And you do that by creating a number of choices of what native species to start with to foster and catalyze the natural successional process. Succession is like the natural evolutionary advance of the species that are native to that area. So, for example, snakes and reptiles are definitely one of the category of fauna that are measured. Their bird surveys are important. There are even some companies that are doing things like they put high gain microphones in the canopy of forests, and they listen to the total sound of night insects, and they use that as sort of one of the variables that they monitor as to whether or not they're able to restore to that value for for the insects. They're not measuring and monitoring, but they have these high gain antennas up in the canopy, and they use gross call and sound and volume as one of the metrics, right? So there's a lot of really interesting ways to monitor and count biodiversity and count the forests and the carbon in soils, which are really tricky. So that can be difficult. But yes, we certainly are trying to pay attention to what biologists would term the most important trophic levels of the food chain, so to speak. Anybody else got one? Yeah. Thanks for the questions, by the way.
Hi. I'm wondering when such credit is created, when you put a seed into ground or when the trees is coming up, or in 20 years when it comes, and how the value changes. The second question is, which markets recognize such credits? Is it all the world or only Western cultures, or?
Okay, so two really good questions. For a nature-based solutions project that's focused on flora, right? It's focused on planting or restoring ecosystems that are degraded. You get the credit. So there's a process to build a project to get certified, and usually that happens after you've already planted and some growth has happened, and you have to sort of send an auditor to the site at least every 5 years. So you issue credits roughly every 4 to 5 years. Those credits go on an international trading registry that looks like a commodities exchange. And people all over the world are able to purchase them. So, for example, if I make a credit in Saudi Arabia through a mangrove reforestation project, when the auditor goes and confirms that my report of how big the trees are and how much carbon is in the soil, they confirm that, and then once they do that, they'll issue a report essentially saying, yeah, they were right, or they overestimated, or they underestimated, and then credits are created. They're serial numbered and they're time-stamped for the issuance year, and those then can be traded off the registry like, I don't know, like gold or lead or pork bellies and corn. Anybody can buy them. Each of those carbon credits, however, there are a couple of certification standards that have the majority of the market. Vera and the gold standard are probably two of the biggest. There are a couple of others now for jurisdictional approaches like art trees. And those credits can be traded and retired. So when somebody buys it and retires it, that serial number on the registry is no longer available for sale ever again, right? And that's when the atmosphere receives her benefit. And I think if you're in a 40-year project and your trees they have like a growth curve, right? They'll grow fast for a while and then they'll start to taper off. And you slice that into sort of 5-year tranches. Each issuance of those credits are available for sale once they're on the registry. There is an opportunity to pre-finance projects by pre-selling credits and de-risking those activities, and then the buyer gets them at a discount, essentially, which is like every other sort of pre-purchase agreement or streaming agreement. Yeah, one more?
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I walked in a bit late, but the question I have is, how are these projects financed at the beginning? So that's the first question.
Great one.
And then second, it appears you're more geared towards the companies doing the project. So what if a government has a situation where they have a lot of abandoned mining sites, maybe abandoned by illegal miners or artisanal miners? What approach can the government take, maybe in partnership with a company like yours, to rehabilitate that ecosystem and in that environment? So yeah, 2 questions.
Super. All right. That sounds like somebody from a ministry with a particular challenge, and I appreciate that. The 2 questions are, how are these things paid for, which is an amazing question in a speculative, relatively new market. In the 23 years of carbon credit projects, in the beginning, they were all pilots and they were paid for by the company developing them or the asset holder, which is sort of a project proponent, which could be a mining company that has a concession. Now, as I was mentioning earlier, I don't know if you were here for that, but sort of venture capital and large investment houses are starting to pay attention to this commodity market, and they're starting to enter the game, and they have a totally different approach to how they would finance these activities. And my colleague is here. He works in a deal structuring team at South Pole that works with investors that are potentially interested at scale for restoration activities, and they want the carbon as the revenue product of their investment for to create the new forests and the stable ecosystems of the future from degraded lands. So there are many other ways, and I'm not going to go into the many details, but you can build a carbon credit project by promising to sell the credits at a fixed price to somebody, and they'll give you upfront capital for that. Or a streaming agreement for some of your expected revenue, right? So suppose I have a reforestation project in your country on your degraded mine sites, and I anticipate in the project development document that I'm going to generate 1 million credits every 5 years, or every year, 1 million credits, and I pre-sell 500,000 of those to a company like Aramco that has a greenhouse gas footprint and a net zero target. And they have some price indicator that slides with market, and the seller of the project sort of gets to share in price changing, right? It used to be you did so at a fixed price, and then everybody said, well, I locked in 10 years, and the market tripled. Well, I just totally lost, right? So now the market's getting smarter. So one way is you pre-sell, and you get payments because they need a lot of upfront capital, and then it's sort of operations through time. Another is these large investment capital houses are looking to bundle multiple projects. So it'd be your country's restoration mandates and 4 other countries that are neighbors, and they want to bundle them all together so that they can make an investment at scale, right? And that has proven to be a little challenging for the carbon market players and participants, because we started in this sort of mom and pop artisanal market where people built projects by bootstrapping them along, and that no longer is going to fit for purpose. And so it's really interesting to think about how the market needs to evolve now that the investment appetite is so much bigger, and frankly, all of the signals of the impacts of warming are more and more evident, right? So, but we would bundle all of those various landscapes that you described, where we have project activities that generate carbon benefits together into one project. There's another question in the back.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I've set up my own capital investment company a few years ago, and from day one, I was planning to set up this carbon credits trading fund. But it has been a challenge to complete the entire ecosystem, because dealing with the Capital Market Authority, they need me to separate the fund custody from the fund's operation to ensure there's governance and ensure that there's very well documentation. I couldn't find a custodial.
You couldn't find a what?
A custodial
Yeah.
for the carbon credits themselves. And so I can scale up my fund, my carbon credit trading fund. And the scaling is another challenge that I'm facing as well. But I'm very helpful because there's this green, Saudi Green initiative that could really take advantage of that and start, creating some carbon credits based on these Saudi Green initiative. The challenge is that I'm still looking for custodial and a different operational, and the pricing is another challenge as well. And how can you find good pricing mechanism? So I wonder, what's your thoughts on that?
That is an integrated, complicated question. I will address the parts of it that I'm better suited for. And as I'm sort of a project-oriented professional, right? So there are a number of people that are looking at trading platforms and markets and how the custodial and what the end demand looks like and what the certification standard to sell at and what those price projections look like. I alluded to some of the price projections from a company called MSCI, which used to be known as Trove, which is one of the main sort of price modelers and projection. But I would warn you that because the carbon market is relatively new, we're 2 decades plus, and we've seen a fair amount of volatility in market pricing by project or sector type. So South Pole is resistant really to go beyond 6 years in our projections. And honestly, 2 is really where we're more confident, because there has been so much motion in pricing and there has been so much evolution of compliance markets which dramatically changed the pricing, right? I would say 3 years ago, most NBS credits traded for under $5 US, and yet the new Corsia market is so undersupplied, we're expecting $30 to $60 for the same project and the same metric ton of CO2e that's certified, but because it's now a compliance instrument, it's become a significantly more valuable asset. Now, with respect to the projections of those prices, they're pretty good, we're pretty good. I think here in Saudi Arabia, the expectation of an understanding of the policy framework that's going to lead to solutions to some of your questions is the advent of a national compliance market, which there is whisperings of. We've heard that it's going to be here in 2027. Others sort of allude that 2029 might be more realistic. But when you have a national carbon market, there will be fixed prices for project types, as well as government incentives to achieve the market and the trading. And I expect that the custodian of those credits will be the issuer or the project owner, will hold while they broker in the national market for what should be risk-reduced known pricing, much like the Singaporean carbon tax market. Does that help? Happy to talk about that or put you in touch with my colleagues who might be better suited. Anybody else? Monitor for biodiversity or carbon. You feel your roots, your toes are moving into the ground, growing like trees as we sit in the chair too long today. Anyone? Going once? Last chance? Thank you so much for your attention at the end of the day. I know it was a slog. And hopefully, if you're interested in buying a carbon credit someday, you should do that, especially as you fly home, right? Should think about some of our sustainability impacts as we transition, hopefully to a more high-impact, sustainable 2025. Thank you all so much for your time. It was a pleasure.